faculty, our board of trustees, our alums, our large students, and friends of the college. Allow me to go over a few Zoom details. This lecture is being recorded. All participants have been muted, or soon will be muted, so we do not get a lot of background noise. For the first hour, Professor Fitzgerald, otherwise known in the Regis community as Fitz, will share his lecture, The Pandemic Narrative. We tell ourselves stories in order to not to die. Sorry, Fitz, I totally blew that. For this portion, we ask that you stop video and use speaker view for your screen. Following the lecture, we will use the remaining time to answer questions or share your comments. You're welcome to turn your videos back on then. Please use the chat box during the lecture to ask questions or offer comments you may have. Dr. Megan Gibbons will manage the chat box as questions come in. We'll get to as many questions and comments as possible after the lecture. I'm now happy to introduce Dr. Fitzgerald. He serves as Assistant Professor of Humanities and General Education and teaches courses in religious studies, ethics, and English. His research interests include the history of literary journalism, media studies, American literature, religion, and medical and digital humanities. Dr. Fitzgerald is currently at work on a book that reconsiders the history of literary journalism with a focus on the role that women writers played in its 19th century origins and the way emerging media have continued to shape the genre's history. He also maintains a lively Twitter feed, and I recommend that you follow him. And now I'm going to turn it over to Fitz.
Thank you so much, Dean Edney, for the introduction. I have to share my screen. I say this to my students all the time. There's nothing worse than watching somebody fiddle with technology, especially when you're on the other end of a Zoom call, but nevertheless, we must. So I'm going to share that. And I think that you can see my screen. It says that you can. So yes, so again, thank you, Dean Edney, for the introduction. I am so happy to be here, and I'm so grateful to everyone who signed on. A special thank you to the students in the Zoom room. I joked to all my classes that I don't usually give extra credit, and that's mostly because I'm really bad at math. But wow, I should probably definitely consider giving extra credit more often, seeing all the people that showed up. So thank you. And on a serious note, to those students in my classes, I'm especially grateful because we haven't even settled on what the extra credit's going to be yet. So you still showed up, and I love that. Thank you. And I also want to say thank you to Mary Lou Jackson and Megan Gibbons and all my colleagues and co-teachers in the pandemic course, or I think it's called Living and Dying Through a Pandemic. I always forget the name of the course. I would highly recommend it if you have not taken the course. It's a great course, and I have learned so much from my colleagues that I teach the course with, and I hope that's reflected a bit in the presentation tonight. So a quick note about my slides. At the suggestion of Dean Kaler, I'll actually be showing art and other visual representations of pandemics, past and present, while I'm speaking. I don't typically use, my students know this, I don't typically use PowerPoint presentations in my classes, but in this case, I find this is just a really cool idea, I guess, that Dean Kaler gave me to present these images. So in some cases, the slides will be directly related to what I'm saying. In other cases, like right now, they're just pretty pictures for you to look at while I'm talking. And they only relate, to the extent that I'm talking about representations of pandemics from the humanities perspective. So that's a note on the slides. Okay. So it's strange because my students will also note that when we are in a Zoom room, I usually insist that your cameras are on, but I think it makes sense why we're not doing that, but I'm just making sure you're here still because it's awfully quiet on my end. Let's get started. So for the past several weeks, I've been researching and interviewing healthcare chaplains for an article that I'm working on about the role that they play in the changing face of American religion. The basic idea is that as religion in the United States deinstitutionalizes, right? Fewer people are attending churches, less denominational identification, more people who identify as N-O-N-E-S, nuns. They are spiritual but not religious. As that sort of picks up as a trend, Americans are looking elsewhere for their spirituality fix. Especially in times of crises like this one. And chaplains have really emerged as particularly important proxies. To To be honest with you, this has been completely life-giving work for me. I've literally just been having these incredible conversations with people who feel like they're called, with various levels of religiosity implied there, to attend to people suffering by way of spiritual care. The stories they tell me of sitting with a trans person mid-transition, of witnessing the last breath of a beloved son and celebrating the man's life with his mother, of holding the hand of a woman who was completely at peace with her passing. These stories are so incredibly moving. The phrase that many of the chaplains use to describe their work is meaning making. And that feels like such a powerful way to describe the magic that happens when we share our stories. And of course, we've heard a lot over the past 10 or 11 months of the heroes, right? The doctors, the nurses, the first responders, and the like. And of course, they are doing such important work, but I've not heard any acknowledgement of the important work that healthcare chaplains have been doing. And I've started to wonder if this is because they're not in the business of saving lives, but rather in many cases of witnessing death. The tools of the trade for a healthcare chaplain are not stethoscopes and syringes, but stories. Listening to the stories and sharing the stories. That's what they do, making meaning. And this is, I believe, profoundly important work. So I bring this up at the beginning here, not necessarily to raise the profile of chaplains. I'm hoping that the article that I'm writing will do that to some extent, but rather to say that some of the most important work happening in hospitals right now during this pandemic is as simple as sharing stories. Still, all of that said, it would not be unreasonable for you to ask yourself, what is a professor from the Humanities department giving a lecture about a pandemic? And to you, I would say, fair point. Not too long ago, I might have also asked that question, but then I was introduced to and became fascinated by this emerging field called medical humanities. And again, if you're feeling like I'm talking in oxymorons, that's okay. Medical humanities as a field is diverse and varied, but if I could try to encapsulate it for you, I'd say that it is the acknowledgement that the disciplines of literature, history, philosophy, ethics matter very much to the medical practice. And as such, medical humanities attempts to provide an alternative kind of education to aspiring medical professionals, perhaps like some of you in the room today, that takes into account the human side of healthcare. Okay, but still, PhD in literature, what can I say about COVID? To answer this question, I want to offer you a kind of two-part thesis statement for my talk. My students will recognize that I like to start my class by telling you what the day's thesis is, right? What is it that I'm on about today? Well, here it is for this talk. First, humans understand the world primarily in the form of narrative, and there is nothing outside of narrative. That is, even scientific disciplines create stories about the world in an effort to understand it. So specifically for this talk, I'm going to draw on Duke University professor Priscilla Wald's concept of the outbreak narrative to help us understand the story that we tell about pandemics, including this novel coronavirus. So that's the first part of my thesis. Narrative is everything. The second part is related, and that is that history, of course, the stories that we tell ourselves about our past, can help us understand our present moment. This shouldn't be too shocking. I mean, we've all had to study history throughout our education, and hopefully by now you've come to understand that the reason is so that we can learn from the past in an effort to improve our present and future. And this is just as true when it comes to global pandemics as it is in relation to the history of wars and exploration and the other things that are often covered in history classes. Okay, so we understand the world through narrative, through stories, and the stories of pandemics past can help us understand our current predicament. That's my thesis. So let's talk about stories first. Joan Didion, who is a literary journalist and novelist, writes this. You can see the quote on the screen. "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we're writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images. by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. So this is from her 1979 book, The White Album. And she goes on to talk about what it feels like to doubt the stories you've been told. And that's an important discussion, but it's a discussion for another time, perhaps for my Stories of Belief class, if you want to take that small plug there. But for now, I want to hang on the opening salvo, this idea that we are constantly trying to make stories out of what she calls the shifting phantasmagoria, which is a really fancy and wonderful way of saying the dreamlike sequence of images of life. I'd encourage you, I say this to my students all the time, you have your microphone muted anyways, just try to say it out loud. It's fun. It rolls off the tongue. It's great. Phantasmagoria. So let's try to make this concept a little bit more practical, perhaps. Let's say I ask you to tell me about the day that you turned 18. For some of us, this is, we have to think back further than others. What I'm asking for, in one sense, is just a recitation of facts, right? So you could make a bullet list of all the things you did that day. You could do that. But my guess is that's not what you would do. You would probably do something more like say, well, okay, first I woke up and had breakfast, or maybe you woke up and had lunch. I remember being 18 or something like that, right? The point is you can't talk about the things you know without telling a story. Let's look at it another way. Let's say I asked you to explain why people have blue eyes or are left-handed. Assuming you had a firm enough grasp on the science here, and to be clear, I do not, you might tell a story about evolution, about genetics. Your story will have characters, maybe your parents. It'll have a setting. There's conflict between competing genes, and officially out of my depth at this point, so I don't know. Your explanation will have a beginning, middle, and end. It will tell a story. So this is a long way of saying what Joan Didion said so succinctly, so masterfully. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. Of course, there's another way to understand that phrase. In one sense, we tell ourselves stories because it's the only way to get through the day without being totally clueless and confused. But there's also a sense in which these stories give us life. And I think this is equally true and equally important to our current moment. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could live without some effort to try to understand this moment, right? If when COVID hit and all of our lives were disrupted and we went looking for the information as to why this is happening and what we might be able to do to stop it and how we're supposed to go on living, and all we got was no one knows, just blank stares, right? Nothing. We'd go crazy. Or more accurately, because we tell ourselves stories in order to live, we'd just make up a story. And in fact, as we all know too well, a lot of people are just making up stories because they either don't like the narrative coming from medical professionals, or they don't trust them, or they have something else to gain by telling a different story. But that's another topic for another day. So let's shift now from talking about stories in general to talking about the stories that we tell about COVID-19. And to do that, as I alluded to earlier, I want to introduce you to the Duke University professor. Her name is Priscilla Wald, and her concept of the outbreak narrative. And she describes this in her book, which is called Contagious: Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative. And my students know I love showing props on Zoom. So I can't see what you can see right now. Hold on, let me switch over here. So this is the book. I love showing books on Zoom. It's like show and tell, but for grownups. There it is. And she writes this. She writes that the outbreak narrative, what she calls the outbreak narrative, is an evolving story of disease emergence. And she provides some background in the form of this quote. So it's on the screen. Following the introduction of the human immunodeficiency virus, which is HIV, in the mid-1980s, accounts of newly surfacing diseases began to appear with increasing frequency in scientific publications and the mainstream media worldwide. These accounts put the vocabulary of disease outbreaks into circulation and introduced the concept of emerging infections. The repetition of particular phrases, images, and storylines produced a formula that was amplified by the extended treatment of these themes in the popular novels and films that proliferated in the mid-1980s. Collectively, they drew out what was implicit in all of the accounts: a fascination not just with the novelty and danger of the microbes, but also with the changing social formations of a shrinking world. That's a lot of stuff. Let's see if we can unpack it. She goes on to link this concept of contagion beyond epidemiology and into the study of religion and society. She writes, the interactions that make us sick also constitute us as a community. Disease emergence dramatizes the dilemma that inspires the most basic of human narratives, the necessity and danger of human contact. Following the trajectory of a disease is, for Wald, a way to trace the social interactions. She writes, the spaces and encounters, the practices and beliefs of a changing world. And for Wald, significantly, the outbreak narrative rises to the level of myth, not in the sense that the story is made up, but rather as an explanatory story that is not specifically authored, but emerges from a group as an expression of the origins and terms of its collective identity. So myths are expressions of our identity. And often myths tell more about the myth makers than their specific subjects. Wald, following Joseph Mali, tells us that myths are especially prevalent during times of rapid social transformation. And the contemporary myths, the stories that we tell now, contain within them all the myths of the past, as well as actual science and social concerns. So I want to be clear that when I say like myth here, we're not talking about like, I don't believe in this, right? Myth as in like it's a fiction or it's fake or something, but actually myth as a way that we express our collective identities, right? Myth as the stories that we tell about ourselves in this way. So just like plots and narratives tend to be formulaic, you know what I'm talking about. If it's an action movie, you kind of know how that's going to unfold. If it's a romantic comedy, you know what's going to happen, right? Wald writes that the outbreak narrative, whether it appears in scientific literature or in journalism or in fiction, also follows a kind of formulaic plot, which includes the following sort of three stages. There's an emerging infection, right? There's a discussion of the global networks through which it travels. And that's followed by the story of the work that is done to then contain the infection, right? Beginning, middle, and end. The thing shows up, it travels, it makes its way around the world, and then it is eventually, hopefully, vanquished. Beginning, middle, and end. So Wald was writing in the first decade of the 2000s, long before this particular novel coronavirus arose, but the outbreak narrative around COVID-19 has followed this formula. And I want to illustrate that to you, and I'm going to do so by relying on the work of one of my colleagues, somebody who I met and got to know a little bit when I was at Northeastern. Her name is Sari Alschuler, and she is a person who's into medical humanities. She actually kind of introduced me to the field, and she put together this short video, which I'm going to play for us now. And it tells the story of COVID in light of the outbreak narrative. And I've got her permission to show this, so I'm going to share it with you now. And it should work. Let's hope, right? Hold on, I'm doing the thing now where I'm doubting if let me make sure I'm sharing my share sound. I'm so good at Zoom. Optimizer video clip. Okay, now here we go.
Welcome back. In this module, we're going to discuss the COVID-19 outbreak and its outbreak narrative. On March 22nd, 2020, the New York Times published a piece called How the Virus Got Out. Appearing just 11 days after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, the article sought to explain how COVID-19 transitioned in just a few short weeks from an isolated outbreak in a second-tier Chinese city into a global pandemic. The article's opening image was a map that juxtaposed two locations on the streets of Wuhan, a seafood market and a train station. The first site, the Huanan seafood market, has been cast by Western media as an exotic foreign space where outmoded Eastern traditions continue to thrive. As anthropologists Christos Lanteris and Lyle Fernley explain, quote-unquote wet markets, like the one where the cases of COVID-19 first appeared in Wuhan, were depicted and are depicted by Western media as, quote, chaotic versions of Oriental bazaars, lawless areas where animals that should not be eaten are sold as food, end quote. seeking to identify the source and apportion blame. For example, early rumors swirled that a Chinese woman eating bat soup was responsible for the pandemic. Senator from Texas, John Cornyn, drew on this story long after it had been debunked. Quote, "China is to blame," end quote, he declared in mid-March 2020. Quote, "because of the culture where people eat bats and snakes and dogs and things like that," end quote. Cornyn held what he cast as pre-modern eating practices responsible for the outbreak. The second site on the map is the Hanku train station, an emblem of modernity and even futurity. The Hanku station serves as the main terminal for high-speed trains that travel up to 350 kilometers per hour and connect Wuhan to other major urban hubs in China, like Shanghai. When a planned extension is completed, the Hanku station will serve as an intermediary between the east coast of China and cities further inland, like Chengdu, a 2,000-kilometer trip. The station already moves up to 300,000 people in and out of Wuhan each day. The New York Times article faithfully reproduces the first stages of what Priscilla Wald has called the outbreak narrative, and you're going to hear from Priscilla Wald in the interview that we have recorded as part of this module. It's a genre that she describes in terms of a very familiar and highly formulaic story through which we have understood such global health events in the 20th and 21st centuries. The outbreak narrative invariably begins with people marked as quote-unquote primitive, who are, quote, implicitly incorporated collectively as populations into the pre-modern history of quote-unquote humanity and thereby made expendable, end quote. The problem of such disease is, quote, less in its novelty than in its familiarity, as one among many, quote-unquote, frightening maladies awaiting imminent release into the circuits of a global infrastructure, end quote. The outbreak narrative concludes when doctors and scientists contain the threat. In his book, The Next Pandemic, Ali Khan, former director of the Office. The next image in the New York.
Sorry, that's all I need to see of that. But essentially giving you this idea that the outbreak narrative as applied to previous pandemics is also applied here, right? Note this sort of pre-modern or primitive sort of start to the thing, right? If you sort of tell the story in that way, it's captivating, right? It has this sort of like drama that you might think of in a movie about pandemics. And that's sort of what's operating here. And then, Wald does this great job of talking about the way in which the first case, everyone's trying to find the first case of anything and are able to then shift blame onto that person. And then to see how the sort of where the pre-modern or the primitive touches the modern or the contemporary is usually the way that this spreads. And so in some cases, you have the train station, as you saw in Wuhan. In previous pandemics, like in SARS, there was like the flight attendants were carrying it around the world. They were the ones that were held responsible. So we're always looking for this kind of narrative, right, to sort of help us understand, but really also to help us sort of work out the fears that we have about the unknown. So why does it matter that we have these kind of formulaic stories to tell about outbreaks? Wald writes that as these narratives are used to disseminate information, they actually affect survival rates and contagion routes. They promote or mitigate the stigmatization of individuals, groups, populations, locales, behaviors, and lifestyles, and they change economies. I'm quoting here, they also influence how both scientists and the lay public understand the nature and consequences of infection, how they imagine threat, and why they react so fearfully to some disease outbreaks and not to others, at least as dangerous and pressing. Ultimately, Wald argues through her book that understanding these narratives and how they work can lead to a more effective, just, and compassionate responses, both to a changing world and to the problems of global health and human welfare, right? So it's really important to actually understand what's happening in the way that these stories are told, and not just to imagine. My students will be familiar with this notion, this attention to the sort of critical discourse that's going on, that it's not just the story is what the story is, right? When you have this person who's mentioned in the video, this congressman from Texas, who says, you know, we can blame these people, right? You can't just sort of go with the first story you hear, but to understand that stories are constructed and we make stories to make meaning. And the kind of meaning that we make tells us oftentimes more about ourselves than about the story itself. So I think that's a really important point to sort of take off from where Wald is. So in light of this, it is important to contextualize this current pandemic so in light of those that have come before, right? And this again is where history comes to bear. So I should be very clear, a literary historian. I am not a historian of epidemics, but for my part, I simply want to assert the importance of understanding this history in order to better deal with our current moment, right? So understanding the pandemic narrative, the outbreak narrative as it has existed previously, helps us understand how we are dealing with it today. The implications here are many. Certainly, those who are tasked with attempting to control and mitigate the spread of COVID are informed by what has worked or not worked in the past, right? So understanding the past is important for that reason. For those of us who are tasked with teaching, we reach back to history, as we're doing here, to contextualize this moment. And indeed, for all of us, there's some comfort in knowing that we have been here before. And I don't know about you, but there's something strangely reassuring about this image that you're seeing right now. These are pictures of people wearing, a picture of people wearing masks at the time of the 1918 Spanish flu. It makes me feel like we have been down this road before, that life has changed dramatically, but after a while, a new normal arises. And it is that normal that everybody in this room, we're all born into, right? And so understanding the outbreak narrative, understanding that this is a story that we've told before, a story that we have seen before, helps us sort of come to grips with the moment that we're living in now. Also note this person's sign. I don't know if you can read it too well. She says, wear a mask or go to jail. So that's pretty extreme. So the stories that we tell now become the history that we read later to help us make sense of the present. I'm going to say that again. The stories that we tell now become the history that we read later that will help us then make sense of the present. So with that in mind, let's stay in the present just a little bit longer and take a quick glimpse at the kinds of stories that we are telling now and have been telling over the course of this soon-to-be year-long pandemic. So we're going to move away from history, from the stories of previous pandemics, to talk about the stories that we're telling now. And in order to do that, we have to do this. Yesterday was Groundhog Day. So my wife and I did our patriotic duty and we watched the film, which stars the great Bill Murray. This film came out in 1993. So as I was preparing my notes for this talk, I have to sort of reckon with the fact that it's very likely that many students here haven't seen it. You should. I should just say that right now. And it's okay to watch it the day after Groundhog Day. And the plot, very fortunately, is easy to summarize, right? So Bill Murray's character is a weatherman named Phil, and he finds that every morning he wakes up to the same day. It's Groundhog Day, and he's forced to repeat that day over and over. And the movie is really about how he finds his way out of that loop. It's fantastic. The movie's come up a lot in recent months during the pandemic, before even actual Groundhog Day, during the pandemic and during quarantine, because a lot of us, I think, felt like we were living in Phil the Weatherman's nightmare. Every day was the same. Another day in quarantine. But I was struck by something else as I watched the film yesterday. After Phil comes to terms with his situation, and you have to know that he initially uses, like, the fact that he wakes up on the same day every day, he initially uses that first to learn everything that he can about particular women, and then to thus seduce them with the knowledge that he has learned. So not awesome. And then to cause general mayhem with no consequences. Once he realizes there's no consequences, he does crazy things. And then he actually it gets a little bit dark and he gets tired of that reality and he tries to kill himself in a number of creative ways. But after all of that, he begins to improve himself by reading poetry, by learning to play the piano, by teaching himself to make ice sculptures, and by doing good deeds around the town. And I think this bears some similarities, of course, to the way that people picked up new hobbies during the long months of quarantine. But it struck me as not a coincidence that Phil's path to salvation came via the arts. As he reads and plays and sculpts, what happens? He becomes more empathetic. He begins to get to know the people of Punxsutawney, which is where the film takes place. And this too strikes me as a metaphor for this moment. The way that stories can help pull us out of ourselves, right? And out of our monotony. And so people have been reading and watching stories like Groundhog Day and like Queen's Gambit or Bridgerton or going back to The Office. And the list goes on and on, whatever your particular quarantine binge was. In the beginning too, some people, maybe this was you, or even watching old movies about pandemics, like horror movies about pandemics. I'm not a big horror movie person, so I did not do that, but I know that was a thing. And I was thinking the other day about a tweet that I remember seeing from, it was the summer sometime, or maybe the spring, that pointed out the irony that year after year of the Trump administration, they kept trying to defund the arts, and specifically the National Endowment for the Arts. And at the same time, like when a pandemic hit, people turned to the arts in record numbers while waiting out the pandemic, right? Because why? People turn to stories in difficult times, right? People turn to stories in difficult times. And during the question and answer today, it would be totally appropriate for you to tell us sort of like what story you turned to. How did you get through? What sort of got you through the difficult time? When we get to the question and answer. But here's the thing, many people also want to tell their own stories about this moment, right? So in some ways we're relying on entertainment that was made prior to the pandemic to help us get through the pandemic. But now also in the midst of it, many people are actually telling the story of now. And in an incredible coincidence, right around the same time that I was planning to teach my sections of the pandemic course in the fall, I came across a feature in the opinion section of the New York Times that was titled "The Pandemic in 6-Word Memoirs." And this is a nod to what has, at least in my circles, become kind of a fun writing exercise, right? Tell a story in 6 words. The form is often attributed to Ernest Hemingway. Maybe some of you have heard of or written your own 6-word stories. Well, Hemingway's famous 6-word story, I think it's the best one, reads this: "For sale, baby shoes, never worn. For sale, baby shoes, never worn." 6 words, a whole story, right? It is the best and the best known example because it gets right to the magic of the form. Literally 6 words and an entire story opens up. Well, anyways, in the New York Times piece, Larry Smith, who created a website that collects what he calls 6-word memoirs, so 6-word stories that are also memoirs, stories about oneself, he solicited and then selected several examples specific to this moment. And I wanted to share a few with you from the New York Times op-ed. So here we go. Not a criminal, but running masked. I like that one. They end up being a little bit like jokes, yeah? Every day is a bad hair day. Every day is a bad hair day. I don't know what that's about. 8th hour of YouTube. Send help. Speaking of the stories that we watch to get ourselves through the pandemic. 8th hour of YouTube. Send help. Required school supplies. Screens, screens, screens. These are going to take a bent towards the educational for a second because my students know that in normal times, unrequired, disrequired, not required school supplies or screens. And yet here we are, screens, screens, screens. This is what time looks like. Too real, right? Do people feel that? This is what time looks like. Numbers rise, but the sun does too. I wanted to end on a positive one. I like that one. Numbers rise, but the sun does too. Do those, they should, I hope, maybe take you back to a moment for yourself during the long months of quarantine and of pandemic, you know, the feeling that can sort of be summed up and told in these really short stories. I think they're really powerful for that reason. I love it. When I teach these in the pandemic course, I ask the students to write their own, and there have been some good ones. And I am going to, this is not a course that necessarily this lecture, but I'm going to encourage you to try your hand at it too. And if there's some time during or after the Q&A, I'd love to hear some of yours if you come up with them. So feel free, while I'm talking, your camera's off anyways, scribble down a 6-word memoir of your time in the pandemic. And if you're so brave and bold, and I know some of my students in some of my classes are brave and bold, I'd love to hear you share them with us. So that's a fun activity for later. 6-word memoirs are one way that people have been sharing stories. And these are mostly by amateurs, just people telling their stories, people like you and me telling stories. But the professional writers and the publishing industry is on it too. You might be surprised by the number of publications that have come out during and about the pandemic. And here's just a brief survey. So Literary Hub, which is a website dedicated to reading and writing, has an ongoing feature called Life in a Pandemic. You can find that on the interweb, Literary Hub, Life in a Pandemic. And it features a bounty of essays and stories. The New York Times Magazine published a special all-fiction issue called The Decameron Project, in which 29 authors wrote new short stories inspired by the moment. And the title harkens back to Giovanni Boccaccio's 14th century book about the plague in Florence, Italy. It's a little history lesson there. There's a collection of stories, essays, and poems called, and I love this title, which references Dante's Inferno. And you can see it here on your screen. And we came outside and saw the stars again. If that's not hope in a half a sentence, I don't know what is. I love that. And finally, Zadie Smith, acclaimed writer of White Teeth and On Beauty and other things that are great, published a short collection of essays written during the early months of lockdown, which is called Intimations. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time here with Zadie Smith and with her book, and specifically her essay, Peonies. We're going to listen to a clip of her reading an excerpt of the essay. I wish that I had her reading the whole thing, but only an excerpt is available. So we'll let Zadie Smith read the beginning to us, and then I'm going to jump in and read the end part and try to pull the whole thing together. And I'm just telling you right now that after hearing her reading voice, you'll understand just how grave a disservice it is for me to be the one to finish the essay, but that's sort of where we are. So let's go to Zadie Smith for just a moment here.
Just before I left New York, I found myself in an unexpected position, clinging to the bars of the Jefferson Market Garden, looking in. A moment before, I'd been on the run as usual, intending to exploit 2 minutes of time I carved out of the 45-minute increments into which, back then, I divided my days. Each block of time packed tight and leveled off precisely, like a child prepping a sandcastle. 2 free minutes meant a macchiato. In an ideal, cashless world, if nobody spoke to me. In those days, the sharp end of my spade was primed against chatty baristas, overly friendly mothers, needy students, curious readers, anyone I considered a threat to the program. Oh, I was very well defended. But this was a sneak attack by horticulture. Tulips. Springing up in a little city garden from a triangle of soil where 3 roads met. Not a very sophisticated flower, a child could draw it, and these were garish, pink with orange highlights. Even as I was peering in at them, I wished they were peonies. City-born, city-bred, I wasn't aware of having an especially keen interest in flowers, at least no interest strong enough to forego coffee. But my fingers were curled round those iron bars. I wasn't letting go, nor was I alone. Either side of Jefferson stood 2 other women, both around my age, staring through the bars. The day was cold, bright, blue. Not a cloud between the World Trade and the old 7-digit painted phone number for Bigelow's. We all had somewhere to be. But some powerful instinct had drawn us here, and the predatory way we were ogling those tulips put me in mind of Nabokov, describing the supposed genesis of Lolita. He writes, "As far as I can recall, the initial shiver of inspiration was somehow prompted by a newspaper story about an ape in the Jardin des Plantes, who, after months of coaxing by a scientist, produced the first drawing ever charcoaled by an animal. This sketch showed the bars of the poor creature's cage. I've always been interested in that quote, but without believing a word of it. Something inspired Lolita. I'm certain no primates were involved. The scientist offers the piece of charcoal expecting or hoping for a transcendent revelation about this ape. But the revelation turns out to be one of contingency, of a certain set of circumstances, of things as they happen to be. The ape is caged in by its nature, by its instincts, and by its circumstance. Which of these takes the primary role is for zoologists to debate. So it goes. I didn't need a Freudian to tell me that 3 middle-aged women teetering at the brink of perimenopause had been drawn to a gaudy symbol of fertility and renewal in the middle of a barren concrete metropolis. And, indeed, when we 3 spotted each other, there were shamefaced smiles all round. But in my case, the shame was not what it would have once been back in the day, back when I first read Lolita as a young woman. At that time, the cage of my circumstance in my mind was my gender. Not its actuality. I liked my body well enough. What I didn't like was what I thought it signified, that I was tied to my nature, to my animal body, to the whole simian realm of instinct, and far more elementally so than, say, my brothers. I had cycles. They did not. I was to pay attention to clocks. They needn't. There were special words for me lurking on the horizon, prepackaged to mark the possible future stages of my existence. I might become a spinster. I might become a crone. I might be a babe, or a MILF, or childless. My brothers, no matter what else might befall them, would remain men. And in the end of it all, if I was lucky, I would become that most piteous of things, an old lady, whom I already understood was a figure everybody felt free to patronize, even children.
So that's how the essay starts. And I want to continue and pick up toward the end of the essay. That's what I'm going to read to you. And again, I feel like after you've just listened to her wonderful reading voice, now you have to listen to mine, and I am all apologies. So I'm also providing you the text if you want to just go ahead and mute and read along with me. But here we go. This is the end of the essay. So sort of keeping in mind, and I'll bring it all together for us after we read this. But they were tulips, and I wanted them to be peonies. In my story, they will be, they were, and will forever be peonies. For when I am writing, space and time itself bend to my will, through the medium of tenses. In real life, the dog kennel is where I make my home. When I was a kid, I thought I'd rather be a brain in a jar than a natural woman. I've turned out to be some odd combination of both. From moment to moment, and with no control over when and where or why those moments occur. Whether the natural part of my womanhood is an essential biological fact or an expression, as de Beauvoir argued, of an acculturation so deep it looks very much like roots growing out of the bulb. At this point in my life, I confess I don't know and I don't care. I am not a scientist or a sociologist. I am a novelist who can admit, late in the day, during this strange and overwhelming season of death that collides outside my window with the emergence of dandelions, that spring sometimes rises in me too, and the moon may occasionally tug at my moods. And if I hear a strange baby cry, some part of me still leaps to attention, to submission. And once in a while, a vulgar strain of spring flower will circumvent a long-trained and self-consciously strict downtown aesthetic, just before an unprecedented April arrives and makes a nonsense of every line. Amazing, right? Love that. What I love about this essay is that it's not about the pandemic per se, but it is occasioned by it. It's a response to it. The pandemic has forced Zadie Smith and the rest of us too to think carnally, to think bodily, to reckon with our biology, even when, like Smith, and I dare say like me, I don't fully understand it, right? earlier in the essay, she sort of deals with this conflict, the way that we want to control things that are beyond our control, and specifically the way that writers try to do this. So I couldn't help myself, and I'm sharing another quote, even though I just shared you the end. This is from the middle. I just have to. Experience, mystifying, overwhelming, conscious, subconscious, rolls over everybody. We try to adapt, to learn, to accommodate, sometimes resisting, other times submitting to whatever confronts us. But writers go further. They take this largely shapeless bewilderment and pour it into a mold of their own devising. Writing is all resistance, which can be a handsome and sometimes even a useful activity on the page. But in my experience, turns out to be a pretty hopeless practice for real life. In real life, submission and resistance have no predetermined shape. So let me go back for a second because I want to get to that example next, because it's another good one. But just want to linger here for a second too, to sort of, again, reflect on the way that Zadie Smith is talking about trying to shape reality, right, into a narrative. And that's an act of control. So this is, if you think back to what we were talking about with the outbreak narrative, right? When something so big, something so out of control comes up, takes over, our inclination, our instinct is to try to make sense of it, to shape it into something that is understandable. And I think that we have to sort of pay attention to what Zadie Smith is saying here, that it's not just to make it understandable, but to also try to make it controllable, right? Even if that's not entirely possible. So I think that's what really struck me about this essay. And this, I don't know if you caught this sort of turn that's there in the beginning of the essay. The flower that she sees and she's sort of embarrassed of looking at are tulips, but she wishes they were peonies. And then at the end, this is what was here. She says, I'm just going to let them be, they were tulips, but I want them to be peonies, right? In my story, they will be. So there again is that sort of desire to take the reality that doesn't always live up to what we want it to be, to shape it, to repackage it, to turn it into the story that we actually do want to tell. So again, I just love that essay. I recommend this. It's a little book, but it's great. And I recommend it to you. Okay, let's go to one more example that I want to look at. And this is by way of starting to wind this down. So the collection that you see there, and we came outside and saw the stars again, contains an essay by Mario Vargas Llosa from Spain. Llosa is not a writer that I'm terribly familiar with, but his essay, A Return to the Middle Ages, and it's a question mark, it's A Return to the Middle Ages, struck me. And I want to bring us to the end of this essay. So this was written in March, just as coronavirus made its way into Spain. And Llosa is looking back to pandemics past, and he writes, throughout history, the plague has been one of humanity's worst nightmares. And this was especially so in the Middle Ages. It drove our oldest ancestors mad with despair. And notes, this historical fear hasn't quite disappeared today, despite all the advances of civilization. But he assures us that the coronavirus will pass, becoming, I love this quote, no more than old news, an old news story that people barely remember. Right? These are comforting words, of course. But he doesn't leave us with the comfort for too long. Maybe you've already started reading the words I've shared with you on the screen here. This is what we get at the end of his essay. What will never pass is our fear of death, of the afterlife, which is at the heart of a collective dread like the fear of the plague. Religion can soothe this fear, but never fully banish it. There's a disquiet deep inside all believers that sometimes flares up and turns into panic. The fear of not knowing what will be there once we cross the threshold of life into the great beyond. Is it total oblivion forever? Or, like religion tells us, is there a mythical divide between heaven and for the good and hell for the bad, with our final destination decided by a whimsical God? Perhaps there is a different kind of afterlife altogether, one that remains undiscovered by philosophers, theologists, and scientists. The plague brings these questions to the fore, which in normal times are confined to the depths of human psyche, making them essential to the present moment. Mankind must respond to them and acknowledge the fleeting nature of existence. It is difficult for us to accept that all life's beauty, all the adventures life has to offer, belong ultimately to death, and that at any moment it may all come to an end. It's difficult to acknowledge too that if death did not exist, life would be infinitely boring without adventure or mystery, a cacophonous repetition of the most banal and unpleasant experiences ad nauseum. It's thanks to death that we have love, desire, fantasy, art, science, books, and culture, all the things that make life unpredictable, exciting, and bearable. Reason explains all this, but the turmoil that lies within us stops us from accepting it. Fear of the plague is, quite simply, fear of death, which accompanies us through our lives like a shadow. Just going to sit with that for a second. Again, I think the ability to take what is too big, what is too scary, and to narrativize it, to tell us a story that will help us understand it, is what Losa is up to here. So yeah, I mean, I just find that so incredibly beautiful, that passage. But again, note the way that he pulls together history and religion and philosophy and art. This is a response to the pandemic, right? Thank God it's not the only one, because we need the doctors and nurses, the first responders and essential workers, the super nurse that you see in the picture here, the scientists who are creating vaccines that will help us put this pandemic behind us, as Losa predicts. But I have been arguing, I will continue and forever argue that we also need the artists, the storytellers, the historians, and the philosophers, that without narrative, without a way to understand what feels incomprehensible, we couldn't live, or at least not in any way that would resemble a life worth living. So here it is. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. That's what Joan Didion says. In the best of times, that is true. But even, and maybe more so in difficult times, we keep telling stories. We have to. And in these times, we tell ourselves stories in order to not die. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see that you're all still here. Look, you are.
Thank you so much, Fitz. I would invite everyone to either submit questions in the chat at this point, or if you feel comfortable, just go ahead and ask Fitz directly. You can unmute yourself.
Professor Fitz, hello.
Noah, good to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Thanks for having everyone. My question is, I know that you have a lot of responsibilities and you also have a family too. Are there stories that you tell your children in these times to reassure them?
That's a great question, Noah. It's a great question. Star Wars. It's like I say only half jokingly. Yeah, we are all about stories in our family, perhaps not surprisingly. My wife is an artist and I fancy myself a writer. And so, yeah, so we are constantly telling them all kinds of stories. We are telling them stories of before times. We like to tell them stories of what we will do later and what will come. Well, here's a personal note that I'm going to throw in there because Noah, you opened the door wide for me and I'm going to go through it. My dad actually passed away right before COVID, and it was unrelated. He had Parkinson's. And one of the sort of things that we've been doing a lot is telling them stories of their grandfather, which has been really, really nice. And it is like, it goes back to a pre-pandemic time. And it's been really cool to be able to share those family stories as well. So yeah, I mean, this is totally modeled. And I can speak to Noah precisely on this because we've had these kinds of conversations before, to say that we've actually broken out the old family children's storybook Bible, right? And those stories have been also ways to sort of share some history and some context and some comfort in a lot of ways with our children. So thanks for that question, Noah. It's a great question. Anybody else who's out there?
I don't want to undercut any student who wants to jump in, but so you can cut me off. But this is completely to the side of Noah's question. But as you were giving your talk, Fitz, which was wonderful, I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the idea of when narratives maybe fail. And I was thinking about this in part, and I think that stories can be very generative and do help us not to die. But there was some, I don't know, it was over Twitter or someone was saying that, some stories, fiction stories prepped us to think that during something like a pandemic or, a zombie outbreak, that people would run away. And that they were feeling it in some cases, given the various stories circulating about COVID, that people were running towards, and that the zombie movies were even more unrealistic. So in that regard, the kind of narrative that we thought, or maybe it was about the stories we think we are telling about ourselves, don't necessarily line up with when we're living through that story.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think this is a positive and a negative, I suppose, about stories, is that we can choose our narratives, right? And you can choose your story. And again, we've seen like this is really good in some ways, because we have the apparatus in our society to help us determine which are the stories that we should be following, which are the stories that ring the most true, that have the most truth within them. But we have also seen that people have the ability to say, like, I choose not that story and this other thing instead. And so I think in the cases where we find that the story has failed us, that it's not the right story, we need to sort of make that pivot and turn to a different story and find the one. I mean, because I think, again, central to my argument is that there isn't anything outside of story. And so that if you don't like the story that you're in, there's another one sort of running parallel or perhaps perpendicular that you can get onto. Now that gets dangerous, and I think that that's something that I don't really address in this particular talk, but maybe should, which is that stories can also be delusional and can lead you in wrong directions if you are not paying attention to the correct story. And so yeah, so I guess that I think of it like switch rails, find a different or a better story, a more truthful story. And I do maintain, and I taught ethics most recently last semester, so I don't know that any of my ethics students are here, but they'll know that I sort of do maintain that we can determine what the truth is, that we can find that out by way of stories and by way of investigating. And so you can absolutely find yourself in the wrong story, I think. And in those cases, there should be a course change. That answers it.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, I see Kath with her hand up.
Hi. Okay. One, I loved it. It was such a good presentation. It was so interesting. But two, your example / metaphor about the movie Groundhog's Day, I thought was the most interesting, and it made me think of the idea that when we are forced to kind of have this routine that is not desirable, so like COVID, right? We're stuck inside of our own minds, we're stuck inside our own houses, we're stuck into this familiarity. We unlock these skills like the arts and all that kind of stuff. Do you think in many ways we would live a more fulfilled life if we had not, of course, COVID, but we're kind of in a COVID state without being in a pandemic? Do you think that would kind of help humanity more than it hurts, because it has that appreciation on life more than it doesn't?
Yeah, this is a good question, Kat. And I think a lot about I'm very skeptical of the things that are going to change after the pandemic kind of conversations, right? We're never going to go into it well, in fact, because we just talked about this in class, I have serious questions about the future of snow days. For example, is that something that's ever going to come back again, or are those gone forever? So I think a lot about, what is the good thing? What are the good things that we can take with us out of this time? And I think sort of being mindful of and sort of the opportunity that we've had to slow down and appreciate stories and appreciate the sort of true things that bring us happiness is really good. And I do hope that that's something that sticks around. And I think that is directly related to snow days, by the way. So yeah, so I mean, I think there are certainly some things that that we should take with us, and that might, you know, be chief on the list, right? This ability to appreciate the stories that we tell about ourselves. Does that answer your question? I hope. So, thanks, Kat. I see. I don't know. Something's happening in the chat. I'm not looking at it, but
I was just going to tell you, Dr. Fitz, there's some people have shared their 6-word story.
yes.
So if you want, I can read a couple that are
Yeah,
here.
would you? Oh, I can't wait.
All right. So we have wake up, go to bed, repeat.
Okay, I love it.
Then we have sleep and sleep, but no rest.
Oh,
I think we have some more that came in too. So give me 1 sec.
yeah, these are sad and good.
No more snow days. Very sad.
Did I write that one?
And I'm stuck all alone and miserable.
Oh, friends, we're here for you. Stories are here for you. Thanks for sharing those. Keep them coming. That's awesome. Are there any other questions?
I have a question like pertaining to like, it's kind of talking about how narratives have kind of existed throughout the pandemic, but it's kind of gone into like a new mold, how like Netflix has been like booming with everything.
Yeah.
And I know I wanted like your opinion to see if like, do you think Netflix is being like the more story like oriented, especially within like our population, where it's like the younger kids are going towards that and that's why they're becoming alone? Or is it like people are like sharing more? Like since we're stuck in our house with like just our families and stuff like that, sometimes people only originate with them, but sometimes other people will just like seclude themselves in the one room and only focus on those.
Yeah. And this is a great question. I'm so amused by the, I think Netflix has this, some of the other platforms too, that have the like party, what is it, like viewing party or something like, does anybody do that? But I think it's acknowledging and responding to that, just that issue, right? That the way that I mean, you can watch, maybe some of us do, you can watch Netflix or Hulu or whatever on a TV with people around you, but you can also just sort of have it on your small screen and be right here and be alone with the story. So yeah, I mean, I think stories are meant to be shared and meant to be sort of social activities, and they do that, you know, like if you go on to Twitter and people will be talking about whatever it is. So I think the opportunity is still there. I'm an English professor, and so I'm going to sort of always roll back on like, I would love it if, and I think this has happened to an extent, that those stories were, that we're all talking about and getting excited about weren't on tiny screens, but in books. But I mean, I don't know, maybe that's unrealistic, but I think that, you know, it's an interesting time for TV. And yeah, I mean, is Hulu like, was it Hulu that's promising like a new movie every week, which feels a little bit aggressive? It's good and they've been good, right? And there's really interesting stories that are being told, but how long will that keep up? And are they all worth watching? And do you feel like you're supposed to watch them all? So I have lots of questions about that too, Erin, and I'm really happy that you brought it up. You know, on the one hand, I am really happy, and I think it's inevitable. Like, it's not something to even be happy about. Like, when we needed them, there were stories there. That's good. And we watched them and we shared them and we talked about them. Can there be better stories? Yeah, probably. But I don't know, I guess we take what we can get at this point. So thanks for that question. I like that. I've been watching a lot of Netflix myself. Anybody else?
Fitz, I have a question.
Sure.
So can you repeat and then expand upon something you said, and that was something about narratives in the moment, sort of create the history that helps us in the present. I didn't write it down. I wish I had, but if you could kind of share that again. I thought it was pretty profound when I heard it the first time, and then maybe expand upon it a bit.
Yeah, let me, okay, yeah, it's a little confusing. So yeah, so I had said that the stories that we tell now become the history that we read later to help us make sense of the present. So the stories we tell now become the history we read later to help us make sense of the present. Yeah, I mean, I just been thinking a lot about even, I mean, on a personal level, the story is that I'm writing down the way that I will remember this particular time. And I think I want that to be an invitation, not just for like, not thinking like on a global scale of like the history books, like how are they going to remember this time, but for all of us to sort of note that like, there are things that we should remember, right? And to Kat's point, there are like things that we should carry forward with us from this time. And I think that the only way that we're going to sort of effectively do that is by recording the story that we're living now. And it's hard to do. It's hard to step out of the moment and see what the narrative is, right? Zadie Smith is talking about sort of taking the things that are happening in life and snapping them into a story as a sort of element of control. And Joan Didion, the same thing with the phantasmagoria of life, right? Like life does pass by in these sort of dream-like moments. And how do you then, shape that into a narrative in the moment? I don't know exactly, but I think it's really important. And I get the sense that, to the extent that we're doing that, I guess I'm kind of worried too that I think a lot of, I did some work in what's called digital humanities, and that's sort of like dealing with text as data. And I specifically did some work with like social media posts and stuff. And you can sort of like, if you want to know what was going on in the world on a particular date, like look at the social media feed and like pull out the posts and you can find out what trends were and stuff like that. And, certainly you would narrativize that, but I'm worried that like, that's what we're going to do at some future point, is like, we're just going to take the temperature of our moment via social media or something, where I think I would much rather know, the sort of stories that people were recording. Is anybody familiar with NPR does this thing on Fridays called StoryCorps, where like two people go in and they tell a story and they record it, and it goes into the Library of Congress. And I just think like that kind of thing is what I had in mind. It was like, can we just tell this story right now so that later we can use that to remember and sort of unpack with this time, because we can't do it now. It's too hard. It's too hard in the moment to figure out what's going on. Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we did just have a question come through in the chat. So it's coming from my perspective as a nurse and using the science lens. Do you, as an English professor, attach any meaning to our need to call a pandemic the Spanish flu or the China flu?
Yeah, right. So this is a huge part of the outbreak narrative. We want to know. Priscilla Wall does a lot of talking about a lot of writing about typhoid Mary, right? We want to know who we can blame for this. Whose fault is this? That is 100%, I think, what that's about. I mean, I never really gave it much thought because we just called it the 1918 Spanish flu until I started to think about, why am I so sort of viscerally opposed to this idea of like the China virus or whatever? And then realizing like, oh, it's kind of the same, by sort of tagging something from where it's from is a way to sort of shift the blame onto that place and say like, aha, we have found the villain of this story, right? We know now why this bad thing is happening to us. And I mean, Trump did not hide that at all for a moment. I mean, he would keep saying like, they did this to us, right? So that it was like the outbreak narrative was just like thrust on us like every day during the administration, because we had found our villain and we had to sort of make sure that everybody knew who was to blame for this. So I think that's a great question. I also want to say I didn't know I love questions that start with like from the nurse's perspective, because I have found such resonance. Like this is not a thing I predicted as an English professor, as a person with a PhD in literature, that I would find so many ways to connect with and just sort of love talking to people that come from nursing backgrounds. But specifically in my Stories of Belief class, I just find time and again that students who are training to be nurses just love that opportunity that comes in that class. It's all about stories. Obviously, it's in the name. Stories of people gaining faith or coming to faith or losing faith or wrestling with faith. And all of the students that are nursing majors that come through that class always walk away thinking like, wow, I am going to have such a new appreciation, a new understanding of where my future patients, or even in some cases current patients, are coming from, because I understand that the decisions that they're making are so informed by their beliefs, right? The stories that they sort of have internalized about why the world is the way that it is. And knowing that is just eye-opening, I think, and has been for so many students that come from nursing. And I have likewise learned a ton from them in that class, and in particular, in terms of what empathy really looks like So I love that question. I took the opportunity to say more than what was asked, but I hope that's okay. Any other questions out there? This is the most fun part. I hope there are.
I have a question.
Sure.
We talk a lot, or you talked about, I mean, just in this past question, when the narrative becomes almost like weaponized, when we use it to target something else. How would like a normal consumer of social media kind of navigate through finding out whether what we're looking at is really true, or when it becomes some sort of like weaponized statement?
Wow, that's a really important question. You know, in the last several months of last year, I became like adamant that what needs to happen, like what can I do, right? Like, and everything was going kind of crazy. I kept asking myself, like, well, what can I do to fix this situation? And one of the things that I became abundant, it wasn't just my idea, it wasn't just my sort of stroke of brilliance, but what we need is a class, and I'm saying this about Regis to people who can do things about it, and I'm volunteering, I guess. We need media literacy, right? And so we need something like a media literacy course. We have a track in the humanities department that's digital humanities and media studies, and being able to parse those stories for truth is really, really important. And, you know, it's a case-by-case basis in terms of how you do that. But I think that if you are listening to a narrative that is intentionally against something, you're probably listening to something that's overly skewed in, you know, in a particular direction. I think that would be one way to do it. You know, you're going to look for something that can be confirmed by multiple sources, I think is another strategy, which again is going beyond just like, how do we sort of navigate these stories in terms of how do we become media literate in a time where we're just sort of swamped with media. And it's hard to figure out what the truth is. But I think that like a good rule of thumb, I don't know if I haven't thought this through all the way, so I'm going to say it without having thought it through all the way. But I think a good rule of thumb is if the story feels like it's against somebody, if it's told against a person or a population, it's probably not the best story that's out there. There's probably a better way. And I think one of the things that's like I call it magic, and I think it might be a little bit of magic of stories, is the way that they help us to enable us to empathize, which is to literally put ourselves in another person's shoes, so to speak. And if a story is not doing that, it's probably not a good story, right? Like, it's probably not the story you want to be listening to, because that's why we do it, right? That's why we share these stories, to understand where other people are coming from. I think it's a great question, and I'm gonna do my part to advocate for this media literacy idea, because I think that's really important. Thanks for that question.
Fitz, there is another question that came through in the chat, and it's this. You mentioned focusing on the right story and how stories can become delusions. Can you share an instance where you or someone else had trouble separating reality from a story that you or they merely hoped would be happening?
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
And while you're thinking, we've got some great six
let's hear some great
six words that are still coming through the chat, right? So,
and I'll be thinking about the lies that I tell myself. Yeah.
Winter screams, work late, bow head. Should read books, but screens everywhere. Will our future lives ever unfold? I'll pause there in case you want to jump in, but you'll see these, they'll all be saved in the chat, and they're great ones.
Oh my gosh, so did you all know, friends, that one of my roles here at Regis is faculty advisor to Humanity, our student literary magazine. I'm going to ask that maybe you'd be willing to, maybe we should do a section. I'm talking to Noah and to others who are also on Humanity. This might be a good idea, right? Get some of these collected. Rosa, I see you. Get these collected into Humanity. Something to think about. I'm thinking now about, so my understanding of the question is sort of a time when I feel like I have followed the wrong story. And man, my students know that I tell them on day one, they know because I tell them, and I tell them because I am, in fact, the thing that I tell them, which is that I overshare. I do that in class. I feel like in order to get a good relationship going between myself and the students, I just say lots of stuff about myself, and then they feel that they're comfortable to do that too. So why not, right? With 55 of my new closest friends. I grew up, this comes out in Stories of Belief all the time. I grew up evangelical, really conservative. And I think I lived a lot of my life thinking that I was right and everybody else was wrong, with devastating consequences, really. And so my sense of the right and the wrong story and navigating between those is absolutely and 100% influenced by that experience. That like, I know and remember what it feels like to be so fully convinced of one particular story, and then to sort of arrive at some other place in life and look back and say, I think that was wrong. I've actually, again, just going for it here, I've actually apologized to people I went to high school with, like, sorry, I was on the wrong story there. And I was so convinced that I was right and righteous. So yeah, that's, it's huge. It cuts right to the core of why I am so adamant about this. My life starts with stories and navigating between the ones that are the sort of the right stories and the wrong stories. Thank you for that question. I'm gonna write about that later.
I should be productive, but TikTok. Bottoms up. Today, yoga pants again.
So good. So great.
And I apologize for whomever I may have missed. So there were some in the middle there that I might have overlooked, but
No, that always happens. Oh, those are so awesome. We'll be in touch about Hemedera. Cool. Are there any other friends, any other questions? Any of my students want to show how smart you are to the rest of the crew here? Jack's shaking his head. I see you, Jack.
Professor Fitz, may I ask one more?
I think you can. Nobody else is doing it, buddy. Go for it.
Well, I've read your work, like the stuff outside of Regis, and with your credentials and experience, personal and professional, I feel like when I think of the discussions you have, they're tied both in literature and in religion.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of to specifically address what you talked about, the importance that you realized of, like, I believe, hospital chaplains,
Mm-hmm.
Whether in your own life or you've seen in the outside world, have you observed a change in the relationship between people and religious stories? Like what those stories mean, what those, ancient tales have meant, or what they represent now?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, what's really cool about this hospital chaplains thing, and it's actually, I've expanded and I'm talking to, there's a military chaplain in there. There's something called movement chaplains, or people that are involved in like protest movements and are there to support the sort of spiritual needs of people that are doing in protest movements. These people are calling them sort of like a new wave of religion, because they are intentionally ecumenical. They might have a particular religious background that they ascribe to, but they're not, when they get out into the place that they're serving, they're not sort of exclusive to it, I guess is what I want to say. A military chaplain, for example, one of the guys that I talked to comes from a Christian Scientist background, but there's not a lot of Christian scientists in his unit. And so he has to be the sort of chaplain for all. But what I'm finding there, what they are really interested in, I think is a new face of religion in America. And it has two components. And one is making meaning, right? So the understanding that having a sort of foundation in stories in a particular religious tradition and the stories will help you make meaning of the present, right? Of whatever you're dealing with in that situation. And so this is people in hospitals sitting, bedside with somebody in the worst, moment of their life. And how can you make meaning of that? And they can draw on the stories that they know, and that can be within their own faith tradition or others that they've studied to help people make that meaning. And the other part of that is through empathy. And again, just sort of trying to understand and try to put themselves in that place to be there with somebody else. What I like about this is that it makes the, and I don't know, this is controversial perhaps, but it makes the stories of any particular religious tradition less exclusive, right? That like, I can draw on a number of stories in order to approach a particular moment in the way that I would draw on, the sort of literary canon to talk to or speak to a moment. If that's not to say, like, I'm not sort of advocating for an idea that like, all roads lead to the same place or anything like that. Stephen Prothero has a great book called God Is Not One, which are, vehemently argues against that. No, none of the religious traditions would say like, yeah, we're all the same. But they are all collections of stories, right? And you can sort of, you can use those stories, you can refer to those stories in difficult times to bring comfort. And that's what I see these chaplains doing, which is just blowing my mind. Is that's a really powerful use, like understanding that, the number of people that actually attend church is going down, the number of people that associate with any particular religion is going down. And yet people still have spiritual needs, and we have the stories, right? We have the stories that are there to help people get through those times. So yeah, it's really cool. I can't wait to see how the article is in, it's in the writing and editing stages at this point, and I'll let you know when it's out, but I can't wait to see, because I think it's telling that story of like something is shifting, and this might be one of the ways that it ends up looking in the future. So yeah, thanks for that question, Noah. Always a good questioner. When I'm teaching, I tell my students that like, don't worry about the awkward silence, right? When we're in a classroom, I tell them that I live in a house with a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. And so silence is literally golden for me. I love it. I breathe it in like life-giving nectar. But silence is different on Zoom though. It's not as good. It's deadly silence. So I'm never the one in the classroom to break the silence, but here I am on Zoom. I had to break it. Any last questions? Anything that anybody is thinking about out there? Kat.
You've talked about like a bunch of stories, and as we've discussed, we've talked about the religious connotations and obviously the COVID connotations. But out of all the stories, do you have like a favorite story or like a favorite anecdote from your time with COVID or in life or anything that represents stuff?
That's really great. I know what I should have done is I should have written my own 6-word story. That would have been really good. I don't know. I'm very much still like in that idea of trying to record and trying to keep track of the moments as they come so that I can put it all together later. So like, honestly, Kath, when you asked me that, my mind went to like the last special thing that happened, which is like literally right before this and after I was done teaching this afternoon. My son was done with his school too, and he was like, "You want to play?" And I was like, "Sure." And we went outside and we played baseball with snowballs and a stick. And it was that thing of like, because I'm self-conscious and I do this and I read a lot of stories. If you read a lot of stories that have strong narrators, you start narrating in your own head. Does anybody else? I see Rosa's nodding along, right? Do you do that? I do that. So like I heard the narrator in my head, but it was saying, remember this, this is too special to forget. So yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. So my mind went to, I'm sure there's been like so many great things, and I'm trying to remember. I take pictures. I'm not a very good photographer, but I take pictures as like that thumbnail for later so that I can get around to it. But I'm shifting my focus to, I had mentioned my dad at the beginning, and I'm really trying to sort of recall those stories, right? And trying to do a better job of in the moment making some kind of intentional move to remember them so that I can bring them back up. Because unfortunately, and my wife will tell you this, my memory is terrible. Like any memory I have has to be filtered through her in the last 15 years, or I just don't have it. So yeah, so right now it's just whatever. And can I for a moment be a little bit sappy? Friends, being back in the class, whether virtual or in person with all of you and having the conversations again. I joked all last semester that I was alone in this space, which is a good space. I mean, I like my space, but it felt really lonely. And so even just being back, you know, I'll remember like the beginning of January as like life surging back in, as I was able to share space with physical space with people. So that's been really good too. Sappy, I know, I go for it. You know me. Was there any last 6-word memoirs that we should hear? Did we get them all?
There was what day is it? Who cares?
Yes. Oh, it's too true. It's too true. Love that. Oh, look, Jack has his hand up, coming in right under the buzzer here.
Not really a question, because I know it's kind of just sitting in silence, but I just wanted to say I highly enjoyed this. This was a really good presentation, and I enjoyed all the anecdotes you talked about and everything like that.
Ah, thanks, Jack. Extra credit for that guy.
The real question is who's gonna like go after you? They should be intimidated.
You guys are the best. Should we wrap it, do you think? Is that, yeah? Well, so let me be the one then to say just how grateful I am. I'm overwhelmed, actually, if I'm fully honest. I know I bribed many of you to be here, but others I didn't. So, and for those who are going to get extra credit too, I just am so appreciative of you being here and listening and for your questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Fitz. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I know it was enjoyed by everybody. Well worth our hour and a half on a Wednesday night. So I just feel really good. I feel like enlightened and I feel hopeful. And I'm grateful to you for this presentation. And I'm really impressed by our students too, as someone
Right.
else mentioned in the chat. Great questions. Thank you.
So awesome. Yeah, so I guess you're dismissed. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to stay a little while and read the chat because I didn't get to see it. So this is cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fitz. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yep, see you tomorrow, bud.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
I think this is one of the most interesting, I mean, and I think all the lectures have had really great questions.